Alright guys, welcome to F1 News. Big details emerging as to how Red Bull are going to approach their driver market drama, especially if Max Verstappen leaves the team, as some are still expecting him to do come 2027. They looked at Alex Albon. We think they might have looked at Oscar Piastri as well, but what will Laura McKee's target be if that eventuality was to occur? We know that Aston Martin would sign Max at the drop of a hat if they could, but Red Bull, who is their next number one driver going to be if Max does depart the team? A couple of options and a couple of people turn them down under Horner. Would that be the same story this time around? Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Of course, this team is always going to be relevant here at Mercedes. We'll get into why over the coming minutes. Just to start with a few interesting things. We mentioned Portimao yesterday. There have been some further rumours over the last 24 hours that it's possible that Portugal returns onto the calendar. People definitely glorify Kimi Räikkönen's first lap there back in 2020, and it was a great one, right? Don't get me wrong. But not too many other legendary highlights of those Grand Prix. We'll see if it comes back on the calendar. Big update as well on Daniel Ricciardo. He's actually been treated in hospital briefly for minor injury sustained. Now, this of course a bit concerning when you see a headline that says Ricciardo injured in accident, right? Certainly after some of the events that have happened. And we know that F1 drivers, the teams really try and stop them. Of course, Ricciardo is no longer an F1 driver, so he can do what he likes. But the teams try and prevent them from doing things that are too dangerous. Like George Russell went skiing recently for like the first time that he'd ever been allowed to, because Mercedes, for like the entire time he was at Williams and at Mercedes, they were like, you are not going skiing, we are not allowing our drivers to take the risk. The driver that was allowed was Hamilton, because Hamilton does what he wants. You know, he's not going to care what Toto says about, hey, you can't skydive, you can't snowboard, or whatever. Lewis would just go and do it. But for lots of the drivers, they are heavily encouraged not to do any of these things. I mean, Stroll broke his wrist on a bike before Bahrain 2023, and that affected him quite substantially, as we know. Of course, as a former driver, do what you like, but a lot of these guys are kind of adrenaline junkies, so they will be doing stuff that's kind of dangerous. And Ricciardo was in a motorbike accident. All we know about this is that he was briefly hospitalised, and he crashed while riding a motorbike in Queensland. He is okay though, and he suffered injuries to his collarbone, which is not a massive surprise with a bike crash, but it seems that he's okay. He was taken to hospital for medical treatment. It seems that he's okay. So it's not a massive news story, right? It's a minor injury, but still relevant enough to talk about during the summer break. Now, talking of Ricciardo's former team in Red Bull Racing, this is kind of remarkable. This is Adrian Newey's designed RB17, and people have been theorizing how quick could it go, and actually, really more generally, how fast could a car with Formula One technology go if it was not constrained by the rules. Of course, this is a closed cockpit car and also closed wheels as well. They reckon this car in simulations has done a 138 around Spa. Faster than a Formula One car. And maybe on some level that could make sense. You take the limitations off in terms of the aerodynamic regulation restrictions. Could this car genuinely be quicker? And, you know, I think you can convert this into a road car, but fundamentally, it's just an absolute weapon that Newey has created, but without any rules, of course, limiting what its performance capability is. We know nowadays that in motorsport and, let's say, aerodynamic technology and development, the limitation on performance is not technological, it's the man in the cockpit, right? It's the amount of G-force that men can actually sustain and do so consistently. That is now the limitation. So it actually makes sense for F1 to have relatively strict aero rules, but I just think it's pretty fascinating that a car that, you know, you could drive on a track, and I think there's 2 seats in this thing as well, which is crazy. Could be faster at Spa with slick tyres than an F1 car. Piastri's new lap record was a 140.5 during the Belgian Grand Prix. This time it was faster because than usual, because they'd resurfaced part of the track that Hamilton did a few years ago with a 141. But yeah, so Porsche's unrestricted 919 Evo car, which you guys might well know, 2018, that did a 141.7 around Spa. So pretty quick, right? But maybe the RB17 could go even quicker. That's what the simulation says. We'll see if they ever take it there in reality. Now, talking of Piastri real quick, his last Grand Prix that he didn't finish was 41 Grand Prix ago, which shows the level of reliability that McLaren have been able to get to. And if that continues, Piastri is currently the title favourite, and it will continue that way unless something dramatic happens in the championship, like, for example, a mechanical DNF. It feels pretty unlikely right now because the teams have got on top of this heavily since especially 2022, and it feels that McLaren have got that Mercedes engine integrated in their powertrain into that car even better than Mercedes have right now. But in 2026, it could be a very different story, and that's maybe why the other day Toto Wolff, when he was asked the question, who are you most concerned about in 26, he actually said Ferrari. Maybe that's a bit of a nod to the cap to Hamilton, and Fred Vasseur, of course, is good friends of that team, and rumour has it the other day when Max Verstappen was on Toto Wolff's yacht, apparently Charles Leclerc was there as well. So, it's all going on, right? Toto Wolff is playing the game with potential future drivers, especially if those rumours are true, around, let's say, Leclerc not being so happy with the state of Ferrari, and if things continue, maybe he would consider departing. I don't know if that's ever going to be true. I feel like Leclerc will never want to leave Ferrari, but maybe at some point his hand might be forced. The point is, it's no guarantee that McLaren are as strong next year as they are this year. The integration of that new power unit, how that's going to work for those guys is a big question, of course. And we know that McLaren have, suffered with that before. Right now, you've got to make hay while the sun shines. And this is why there is a lot of pressure on Lando and Oscar to deliver the championship, because you never know if this is the only opportunity that you will get to do it in your career, and that is not an outrageous thing to suggest. We know how Formula 1 goes sometimes. Now, McLaren, though, are confident that next year they're still going to be on point. And Andrea Stella mentioned a few things that they've worked on that they believe will still be valuable for next year. So they discuss all sorts of things they've done with the car, but, technical fundamentals, interaction with the tyres, cooling. And it's kind of interesting that he mentions cooling, right? Because that has been the key drama with McLaren this season, was what they were doing with the rear brake ducts. Obviously, Red Bull had many theories, water in the tyres, among other things, using like thermal imaging cameras to try and figure out what McLaren are doing. The conclusion from the FIA is that it's just very intelligent packaging of the cooling in the rear brakes, the front brakes maybe as well. It does have some consequence in terms of higher drag, but it does keep the internal temperatures of the tyres very consistent, more so than any other team can do, and just giving them a massive advantage during the race. The issue is, the other teams haven't figured out yet exactly what they're doing. They know that McLaren are doing it. Everyone knows McLaren have a very clever packaging of their cooling in the rear brake ducts. The FIA basically said it when they checked if it was legal or not, and they said, yeah, it is legal, it's just very clever. And exactly what they're doing, whether they're really riding the lines, whether there will be changes to the regs in 26 and beyonds that change the way that they can do those things, those are good questions. But you would think that that kind of technology could be carried over. Even if McLaren don't nail next year's regulations, you would expect that their ability to control the rear brake temperatures is still going to be, and also therefore the tyre temperatures at the rear, is going to be better than their rivals, just because they currently have a big advantage in that regard. So it's something that McLaren can take as a positive into next year. Ferrari have some positives and maybe some negatives to take into next year. I guess the positive is that surely it can't get any worse in terms of the car not delivering what they expected. We talked yesterday that Hamilton gave some suggestions to the team in terms of what he would change, and even Rosberg responded to this and said, look, he's a 7-time world champion, you definitely have to listen to what a 7-time world champion is telling you. So Hamilton's given his perspective to the team. Whether they're going to do anything about it, that is now the next question. But let's talk about the driver situation and where next for a number of these teams, because we know that Toto Wolff was spotted on a yacht with Max Verstappen, potentially Charles Leclerc as well, just a few days ago, and Max is staying at Red Bull for the next year. We know that to be true. 2026, he's locked it in. It's been confirmed by all the different parties that yes, next year Max Verstappen will be a Red Bull racing driver. But the other big rumour has been that for 2027, it is very much also up in the air, and George Russell is not a guarantee to stay as a result. Currently, he's got no contract for 2027. He's got no contract for 2026 as it stands either. That contract will be confirmed at some point. Toto said it George has said it. They're talking about during it, maybe shortly after the summer break, they will get a deal locked in for George. But what sort of deal is it going to be? With Max, potentially an option. I mean, almost definitely an option if Red Bull don't deliver next year, as people generally speaking aren't expecting them to. You're going to give George a mega money contract. You're going to give George a 3-year deal, guaranteed. Probably not, right? Antonelli is meant to be the next superstar. And yeah, he's had a difficult time over the last 6-7 Grand Prix, but for the first half of the season, he was very good. And I think he can kick on in the second half of the season with a car that is now slightly more compliant again. What are the chances that Red Bull are good enough next year to convince Max that 2027 and beyond, that is the place to be? I think the chances are probably 20% or lower. Given all the factors in play, I just think it's pretty unlikely that Max stays there until his contract is meant to be up in 2028. And we believe that as part of Max being convinced to stay, maybe that was getting rid of Horner, whatever they did to make it happen, we believe that Red Bull have basically told him, look, please stay for another year, but after that, you do what you like, right? We've got to now prove to you. And if it's not working in 26, he'll be able to go. Well, Pablo Montoya had an interesting theory about this and pretty much said that Max is not worth as much as he used to be, which is kind of interesting, really. And maybe there's some merit in that. I think what is interesting is you look at, let's say, the Austrian Grand Prix, there was that big, Max Verstappen grandstand that hadn't sold all of the tickets. And I don't know, it's an interesting one, isn't it? When Max is dominating, winning everything, maybe he's got more fans than nowadays, but also because the car isn't as good, maybe the deal isn't quite as valuable. So anyway, Montoya says, if I was negotiating with Max last year, let's say it might have cost $100 million, this year he's in a struggling car, the number might have been $50 million. Maybe that was the reason that he stayed. So, I don't know, there's a theory that Max is getting paid less money because he's now less valuable or something by Red Bull. I don't know. Montoya always comes up with some interesting ideas. I'll put it out there like that. So the driver market last year was insane with Hamilton's move to Ferrari. Let's say a domino of consequences unfolded from that. But in 2026 into 2027, that's where we are probably expecting the next major upheaval. Because going into 2026, the teams generally want to keep things relatively static. They would prefer not to blow up their team, drop this driver, bring in that guy, get rid of their team principal. Although, as we know, Red Bull have done it. But Ferrari, definitely one of their thought processes will have been, should we really sack Vasseur, given we're only a few months away from the biggest regulation change, aerodynamic and engine, in the history of the sport? Probably not. So they want some consistency. The teams would probably prefer to keep their drivers as it is. Not to say they all will. Some teams will make changes. For example, Cadillac are on the grid for the first time. They have to field 2 brand new drivers. But the teams would prefer, given all the changes for 2026, some sort of continuity on the driver perspective. That's why, let's say for a team like Sauber, Hulkenberg, Bortoletto, keeping that around makes a fair bit of sense. Their contracts expire at the end of next year. Now, presumably, Antonelli, Russell will get locked in at Mercedes, Hamilton, Leclerc are locked in at Ferrari. Now, Hamilton's contract ends at the end of next year. There was that rumour recently that if Hamilton wants to extend that, he is able to do so. Alonso's contract and Stroll's contract end at the end of next year. So the point of this is just to say there's tons of drivers at the end of next season that are going to be out of contract / available. And as a result, as soon as next year gets underway, there is immediately going to be conversation around, well, what next for some of these drivers, especially if their team is underperforming and looks set to have a difficult time in these regulations. Now, if that happens to Red Bull, then it will be expected by many that Max is going to go, right? And I think it is more likely than not right now that next season Red Bull turn up, maybe they've got a decent car aerodynamically, but maybe the engine is quick but unreliable, and Max is, struggling in the championship with maybe not too much hope of getting better if Mercedes have nailed it or if Ferrari have nailed it or whatever. Who knows? But if the car isn't there, if it's not reliable, if it's just kind of slow, Max is going to be like, okay, well, maybe I'm glad I at least gave it a go with you guys for another year, because who knows, maybe Ferrari dominate next year and joining Mercedes would have looked like a bad idea in hindsight. Or maybe Aston Martin dominate next year and it's perfect for Max because he can say, oh, well, I'm glad I didn't join you, Toto. Now I'm going to sign the deal with Lawrence Stroll. So I think what Max is doing is sensible. The point is that it's still pretty unlikely, based on what we understand, that Red Bull nail the regs and that Max is confident that's the place to be. So as a result, in 2027, Certainly in 27, maybe in 28, who knows? But Max will leave, right? And Max isn't going to be there forever. So when Max does leave, especially if it's in 12 months' time and he decides that he's, maybe 10 months' time, 8 months' time, he has a bad start to the season and decides, all right, Toto, or all right, Stroll, right, let's do it. Unlucky Lance or unlucky Fernando, potentially, in that situation. Red Bull need a driver, right? Like, Red Bull need a driver. And this is the issue with having Max Verstappen, is that replacing him is a bit of a challenge. Now, they've tried. They've talked to drivers. We know that for a long time, they were very interested in Lando Norris, right? Lando was absolutely a key candidate to target, to be targeted by Red Bull. But he wasn't so convinced. He felt like staying at McLaren was the thing to do. And he's been proven right, I think, in that sense, Lando. Whether he can deliver now when it matters, that's another question. The same could be said for Oscar Piastri as well. But I couldn't find the original F1 Insider article, but I did find this article. This was from March 2024. The rumour was that there were two targets. If Max was to leave, this was when all the Horner drama was happening and everything like that. If Max was to leave as a result of the Horner drama back then, and now he wouldn't be leaving because of the Horner drama, he'd be leaving because of performance. But if he were to leave, they had two drivers on their radar, one of which was Oscar Piastri. Even back then, before Piastri's become the serious threat that we know him as today, they wanted Piastri. Would they be able to get him? Look, if Piastri and Lando this year have a big battle to the end of the championship, one wins, one loses, and things get kind of tasty, it's not impossible to imagine that one of them could be poached by Red Bull for 2027, let's say, breaking up that alliance at McLaren. It's not impossible. But if Piastri wins the championship, he's going to be their number one driver, effectively. And good luck to Red Bull getting him to go anywhere else. The other option, therefore, that has been thrown around, of course, Russell is now a consideration too. Like, if Max was to go to Mercedes, maybe Russell goes the other way. But one of the other names was Alex Albon, right? Because Alex Albon was teammates with Verstappen briefly. Didn't have a great time at Red Bull, as with basically everybody else that was thrust into that second seat situation. But Albon has told them before to basically get lost, right? I don't want to go and drive for Red Bull again. But understandably, that is in an environment where Max Verstappen is still in the team, right? So if Max is there at Red Bull, then yeah, it's very understandable that you would not want to go and return. Because in 2024, early 24, late 24, there's talk in this article here about Red Bull being very interested in Albon's services, especially because their owner, Thai ownership, getting Albon in, there's lots of things why that could make some degree of sense. And Albon's a quality driver. He's done a great job over the last few years. He's doing a sensational job this season with respect to Carlos Sainz. Race winner, very solid driver, excellent in his own right, and Albon's done a killer job. But understandably, Albon, with Christian Horner at the helm at Red Bull and with Max Verstappen in the team, Albon was like, I ain't doing that. Doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not going to go through that again. But the circumstances have changed. If Max were to go, Horner's now gone as well. Laurent Marquis seems to be running, let's say, a less controversial ship. I think in due course, Red Bull will start to feel like a slightly less a more corporate organization, slightly less just like one man calling the shots and, resulting in some drama, but also that was how the team built its success. So of course, as we know, it goes both ways. But James Vowles from Williams talking about this kind of says, look, in 2026, lots of contracts are up, and because of the season so important in terms of the next few years, it's going to be a big shake-up, right? And he says, of course, he would like to maintain the Albon-Sainz dynamic going forwards, but it may not be so easy. And if Williams are good, but maybe not good enough, maybe they've killed it with the Mercedes engines, but they're still losing to the other Mercedes-powered teams, for example, then maybe Albon could say, you know what? Max is no longer at Red Bull, Horner's no longer at Red Bull, maybe Marco's no longer at Red Bull. That could be a team to consider joining, right? So I think it's something to keep in mind that Red Bull for a long time have been very keen on getting Alex Albon back into the team. We've heard them talk about this on a number of occasions. But Albon every time, even when they offered him like a pre-contract and said, hey, we want first right of refusal to your services. And Albon was like, no, I gained nothing from that. I'm not signing it. I am going to stay with Daddy James Vowles. But in the end, as time goes on, we might see a very different story. And if Max leaves, then they're going to need a replacement, and we know that Albon will be near the top of their list as a result, and I'm sure that the Thai ownership would rather like to see it as well. So very much enjoy your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.